The train platform at Fort Bragg smelled of coal smoke and the faint metallic scent of fear, an invisible vapor clinging to every freshly scrubbed recruit. Private Danny Miller, 18 and pressed into a uniform he felt was still too large, saw her immediately. She was an anomaly. Not a uniformed nurse with the crisp white collar of the Army Nurse Corps, not a hostess for the Red Cross. She was in a full issue, olive-drab Army greatcoat, resting her foot on a canvas duffel bag stamped with the faded letters E. Reed. The coat parted just enough to reveal a pair of scuffed, mud-stained, standard-issue combat boots, worn down at the heels with the specific proprietary curve of long miles walked. Danny nudged his buddy, his voice a low, dismissive hiss of youthful arrogance. "Look at that! They're letting everyone wear the gear now, aren't they? Must be a glorified clerk. Probably never even heard a real bullet." But the woman, older, perhaps 30, with the settled carriage of someone who had seen too much, had heard him. Her eyes, the color of cold gunmetal, lifted and met his, and a faint, almost imperceptible scar, a thin white line, traced the edge of her jawline, disappearing beneath her ear. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. She reached into the deep pocket of her coat, pulled out a small, folded piece of purple velvet, and from it, an object caught the weak afternoon light, a deep, bruised crimson enamel against a backdrop of bronze, the profile of George Washington, a Purple Heart. Danny's scoff died, swallowed by the sudden, profound silence of his own realization. This wasn't a question of uniform. This was a question of sacrifice. The question, the one Danny Miller hadn't even consciously formed, hung in the air between them, thick as engine smoke. What right did she have to that medal, to those boots, to that weary, knowing stare? He was 19, bound for the Pacific, brimming with theoretical valor learned from training manuals and Hollywood newsreels. Evelyn Reed was a ghost of the war effort, a figure too calm for the frantic energy of the deployment zone. The medal she held was the ultimate currency of combat, and in Danny's young, rigid mind, that currency was minted only in the crucible of infantry fire, the blood and mud of the front lines where men like him were destined to fight and die. A woman in a logistics depot, a telephone operator, a typist. She might serve, she might even suffer, but she could not, must not, earn that level of sacrifice. That was the unsaid hierarchy of war, and Evie's Purple Heart was a direct challenge to its foundational logic. Evie didn't need him to ask. She had seen that look 1,000 times, in the eyes of the generals who pinned the medal on her chest, in the nurses who treated her wounds, and in the faces of the fresh recruits rolling through the various staging areas she had called home. It was the look of gendered disbelief, the refusal to reconcile the soft expectation of her sex with the brutal reality of her experience. She let the silence stretch, the weight of the moment pressing down on Danny until he shifted uncomfortably, his own combat boots feeling suddenly oversized and ridiculous like hand-me-down clown shoes. She didn't lecture him on the regulations of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps or the later Women's Army Corps, the WAAC and the WACE. She didn't recite the statistics of the hundreds of thousands of women who served. She simply closed the velvet box, the faint click a final, non-negotiable punctuation mark on his judgment. "You look like you're heading out." "Private," Evie said, her voice surprisingly low, gravelly, a sound that suggested both smoking and shouting over machinery. Her eyes didn't accuse. They simply observed.
"Where to?"
Danny stammered, his bravado utterly stripped away. Lady, ma'am, or wherever the Quartermaster Corps sends us. Heavy equipment. Good luck," she replied, a genuine warmth flickering in her eyes. "The men out there can't fight without fuel and ammunition. That's the real fight, not the one you think you're going to." She then settled back against the wooden bench, pulling her coat tighter, seemingly ready to dismiss him entirely. But Danny couldn't leave it. The Purple Heart was a magnet, drawing out the question he had to ask. It was an insult to his future, unearned suffering if she hadn't truly earned it. "Ma'am," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "if you don't mind me asking, I mean, the regulations, combat. I didn't think the women were permitted to be that close." He gestured vaguely toward the west, toward the distant rumble of the European war, still raging, still consuming. I mean, how do you get one? Evie's gaze drifted past him, through the cavernous train shed and out to a gray sky. She didn't answer with a neat summary of a field hospital disaster or a stray artillery shell. She answered with a question of her own, one that opened a door not into her past, but into the entire hidden history of the women who sustained the war machine. Tell me, Private, what does war look like to you? The flags and the guns, yes. The generals and the speeches. Or does it look like 90-octane aviation fuel and cases of plasma delivered on time in the dark through territory supposedly cleared but definitely still crawling with enemy patrols? She paused, allowing the weight of that logistical nightmare to settle. The war I fought, Private, wasn't fought on the front. It was fought on the line. She then did something unexpected. She stood, picked up her duffel bag, its heavy weight easily managed in her seasoned hands, and looked directly at Danny. You see the boots, Private. You see the medal. You don't see the roads that earned them. Sit down. You've got a long wait until your train. I'll tell you about the night my combat boots got muddy for the very first time. I'll tell you about Stefane and the Italian mountains, and the simple truth that a bullet doesn't care about your uniform's designation, only its trajectory. Danny sat, mesmerized, the platform noise fading to a dull background hum. He was ready for a story of heroism, but he was about to get a detailed, gritty tour of the forgotten theaters of war, where courage wore skirts and overalls, and where the most vital battles were fought not with rifles, but with wrench and radio, rubber and steel. The war, for Evelyn Reed, began not with a grand declaration, but with the desperate need of the Allied forces for competent technical hands, a need so great it shattered the established norms of society. She had come to the conflict not as a caregiver, but as a mechanic and a signal operator, a role that put her in direct and unexpected contact with the very sharpest edge of the Axis defense. And the story, Danny realized, was not about her boots, but about the whole hidden army that wore them. The journey to the Purple Heart began, as all great American stories do, in the dust of the Midwest, in a small town outside Des Moines, where Evelyn Reed was the best grease monkey on her father's farm and the only girl in her high school shop class who could completely disassemble and rebuild a Ford Model A engine. Her hands were made for metal, her mind for circuits. While other girls dreamt of college and white picket fences, Evie was obsessed with the humming, complex, predictable logic of internal combustion and radio waves. When Pearl Harbor happened, the initial national fury was a distant echo. The immediate localized reality was that her two older brothers were instantly conscripted, and her father, already weary, struggled to maintain the farm equipment. Evie, then 21, stepped into their roles without a second thought, driving the tractor, fixing the combine, and listening obsessively to the shortwave radio she'd built herself, picking up static-filled dispatches from London and Berlin. She knew, with a fierce certainty that startled her own mother, that the war would not be won by idealism, but by logistics, by who could move the most material the fastest, and keep it running. When the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was established in 1942, the recruitment posters showed women in smart uniforms, often typing or performing clerical work, but the fine print, the job descriptions tucked away in the recruitment center files, also listed aircraft mechanics, radio operators, and motor transport specialists. Evie walked into the center, ignored the posters, and pointed straight at the specialist columns. "I can fix anything with an axle and a spark plug," she told the bemused, middle-aged recruiter, a woman who looked far more comfortable with a ledger than a lug wrench. "And I can operate a high-frequency radio better than any man you'll find in this county. I want to be where the broken things are, where they need to be fixed now." Her training was a study in contrasts. She excelled in the motor pools of Fort Des Moines, earning the respect of her instructors, mostly grizzled, skeptical sergeants who, after one demonstration of her diagnosing a fouled carburetor by sound alone, began calling her Sparky. She was faster, more meticulous, and less prone to the careless overconfidence that plagued some of the male trainees assigned to maintain the WAAC's transport fleet. But outside the motor pool, the condescension was a low, constant hum. The male recruits training nearby saw the WAAC designation and automatically categorized them as non-essential, temporary help, a distraction. They called them wackies, petticoat soldiers, or worse, whispered crude, baseless rumors about the morality of any woman who would volunteer for service so far from home. Evie learned to filter it out, turning the dismissal into fuel. Every dropped jaw, every scoffing remark, only reinforced her determination to be utterly indispensable. Her specialization quickly became Signal Corps, a merger of her mechanical skills and her radio aptitude. The front lines of the logistical war were not just about trucks. They were about communication, coordinating movements across vast, contested territory. Her orders eventually took her overseas, a jarring transatlantic crossing crammed into a troop transport that stank of diesel and homesickness. The destination, North Africa, the immediate aftermath of the Allied invasion, Operation Torch. This was where the reality of war, the grimy, brutal truth of supply lines in a combat theater, slapped her awake. She was assigned to a motor pool and communications hub outside of Casablanca, a dusty, chaotic nexus where French, American, and British forces mingled under the relentless North African sun. Her job was initially to maintain the generator and radio equipment for a mobile command unit. It was safe enough technically far behind the actual tank battles in Tunisia, but the Luftwaffe didn't respect lines on a map. They respected targets. And a sprawling motor pool full of trucks, fuel, and vital radio gear was an extremely attractive target. The first time the air raid sirens wailed, it wasn't a drill. It was a cacophony of immediate, desperate terror. Evie, asleep in a tent she shared with 3 other WACs, scrambled into her uniform, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The other women were instructed to take cover, but Evie knew the generator, the massive diesel engine that powered the whole communications hub, had a tendency to stall under load. If it went down, the forward units would lose contact with headquarters. She sprinted across the compound, diving into the cinder block shed where the machinery rattled like a nervous beast. As the first bombs whistled down, shaking the very earth beneath her combat boots, she saw the lights flickering, heard the generator beginning to choke. Shrapnel began to ping and whistle against the metal walls. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was supposed to be in a trench waiting for the all-clear. But the communications line was more important than her fear. She crouched down, her small wrench tight in her hand, adjusting the fuel mix, tuning the engine by instinct and touch, willing the power to hold. When the all-clear finally sounded and the hub chief, a harried major named Wallace, rushed in, he found Evie covered in soot and sweat, the generator running smoothly. Its electrical current a vital lifeline to the distant front. The roof of the shed had a jagged hole in it, and a piece of molten shrapnel lay cooling inches from her head. Wallace didn't say thank you. He just looked at her, his eyes widened by a new, reluctant respect. He saw not a woman who had simply endured the raid, but a soldier who had instinctively understood and prioritized the mission. He saw the potential for something more dangerous, more vital than the rules allowed. And it was that silent recognition, that shift from WAC to essential personnel, that marked the true beginning of her journey toward the mountains of Italy, toward the hidden scar on her jaw, and toward the inescapable appointment with a piece of purple ribbon. The war in Italy, which began with the invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943, was a grinding, agonizing war of attrition, fought vertically up the spine of the Apennine Mountains. It was a hellscape of mud, rain, rock, and relentless German defenses. After her successful, unauthorized, yet ultimately mission-critical work in North Africa, Major Wallace had put Evie forward not for an award, but for a transfer to a specialized unit attached to the Fifth Army, a small, highly mobile communications and repair team whose job was to maintain contact between forward patrols and the increasingly distant main headquarters as the line of battle snaked northward. The official designation was still Signal Corps support, but the reality was she was now operating in territory often ceded back and forth between the Allied and Axis forces on a daily basis, the notorious ambiguous forward area where the front was not a line, but a constantly shifting zone of lethal chaos. Her new duty required her to drive, sometimes for 12 or 16 hours straight, in a battered, customized half-track bristling with radio antennae and spare parts. This was where she met Stéphane. Stéphane Dubois was a grizzled, taciturn Frenchman, a former resistance fighter who spoke 6 languages and knew every back road and goat path from Naples to Florence. He was her designated driver and security, a man whose sole expression seemed to be world-weary skepticism. He saw her, a young American woman in a non-combat role, and his initial assessment was blunt. "You are an unnecessary complication," he told her in heavily accented English, adjusting the rifle slung across his shoulder. "This is not a drive in the park, mademoiselle. The Nazis do not differentiate. If they see a radio, they shoot the radio. If they see the person operating the radio, they shoot the person." Evie, who had grown tired of defending her presence to American men, found Stéphane's cynicism strangely liberating. He saw the danger, not her gender. "Then point out the best cover, Stéphane," she said, checking the charge on her radio batteries. "And drive fast." Their first true test came during the brutal push for the Gustav Line, the heavily fortified German defensive position that stretched across the Italian peninsula. Evie's unit was tasked with moving a critical high-frequency radio relay up to a forward observation post perched precariously on a mountain peak, a location called Monte Cairo, which was under constant artillery fire. The primary road was impassable, choked with stalled vehicles and debris from a fresh German bombing run. Stefan, however, knew a forgotten track, a winding, rock-strewn path once used by shepherds. They started the climb in a relentless icy drizzle, the half-track slipping and groaning on the wet rock. The silence, punctuated only by the engine's struggle and Stéphane's muttered French oaths, was more terrifying than noise. They knew the enemy lines were close, too close. Evie, riding shotgun and gripping the radio mic, felt the weight of her uniform, the sheer impracticality of her official duties versus the immediate visceral need to survive. She wasn't just transporting equipment. She was the only one who could operate it at that altitude. She was, in that moment, the mission. Halfway up the mountain, a chilling sound ripped through the quiet air. The high, terrifying screech of a German Nebelwerfer, the 6-barreled rocket launcher the Allies nicknamed Screaming Mimes. It wasn't a single shell. It was a cluster. Stefan slammed the half-track into the side of the mountain, throwing Evie forward. The first rocket impacted 30 yards away, showering them in dirt and stone. The second ripped into the tree line just above them, a deafening explosion of splintered timber. The third landed squarely on the road 20 yards behind, obliterating their escape path. Stefan was yelling, his face contorted. "Get out! Get the radio, we run!" But Evie saw that the impact had knocked the delicate radio equipment loose in the back. A critical vacuum tube, vital for the high-frequency transmission, had cracked. In the 5 seconds before the next volley was due, as Stéphane was already scrambling for cover, Evie didn't run. She wrenched open the back hatch, ignoring the metallic taste of fear, and plunged her hands into the humming, shattered box. She had to replace the tube, secure the wiring, and get it functional now. The whole mountain seemed to be groaning under the bombardment. She worked by feel, her fingers flying, disconnecting the broken tube. Fumbling for a spare from the emergency kit, her entire world narrowed to the fragile, glowing glass in her hand. Just as the next volley began to scream toward them, she slammed the replacement tube into its socket. The radio flickered, then the power light glowed a steady, triumphant green. But the shock wave from the nearest impact was already upon them. The blast hammered the side of the half-track, throwing Evie against the door. A white-hot, razor-sharp piece of shrapnel from the vehicle's frame, sheared off by the force of the explosion, raked across the left side of her face. She felt a searing pain, a wet warmth spreading across her cheek. And then the blessed, deafening relief of the shelling finally stopping. Stéphane ran back, pulling her out of the wrecked vehicle, his face now a mask of pure, frantic concern. "Your face! You are bleeding badly!" Evie, dizzy and tasting iron, ignored the pain, ignored the blood dripping onto her collar. She didn't look at the shrapnel-damaged door. She pointed at the intact radio antenna, still upright. "The radio, Stéphane. Is the signal clear?" He looked at her, at the grim determination in her eyes, at the blood welling from the deep, ragged wound on her jaw, and the skepticism in his eyes finally, truly died. He had seen hundreds of men break under fire. He had never seen someone ignore a mortal threat to perform a repair. He checked the antenna, then the power. The signal was clear. "Yes, Sparky," he whispered, using the name he'd heard the Americans call her. "It is clear. Now let us get you to a medic before you bleed out on this stupid mountain." He carefully helped her down the slope, her feet in those scuffed combat boots, now walking through the mud and rock stained by her own sacrifice. The mission was complete. The young mechanic had been transformed, and the mountain had given her a scar and an unbreakable new definition of what it meant to fight. But the full price of that courage, the moment that truly earned the Purple Heart, was yet to come. The shrapnel wound to Evie's face was cleaned, stitched, and officially recorded as a non-combat casualty, a bureaucratic dodge to maintain the rules that said women could not serve in the direct line of fire. The wound was deep enough to leave a permanent silvery scar tracing the line of her jaw, a silent testament to the lie on the casualty report. But Evie, once again, chose the mission over the paperwork. After a brief recovery, she insisted on rejoining the communications team, now pushing further north into the battle for the crucial city of Cassino. Her reputation preceded her. Sparky was the woman who would stay with the equipment no matter the incoming fire. Major Wallace, unable to change her official designation, simply gave her a heavier weapon, more control over the convoy routes, and the tacit understanding that she was, in all but name, a frontline soldier. The situation around Cassino was a military nightmare. The Allied forces were stalled, facing heavy resistance from entrenched German positions, and the logistical supply chain was stretched to its absolute breaking point. Supplies, ammunition, food, plasma, and most crucially replacement parts for the tanks were running dangerously low. Evie and Stefane were tasked with a high-stakes, extremely time-sensitive delivery. 3 crucial engine blocks and 10 cases of penicillin, needed at a field hospital situated less than 2 miles from the main German defensive perimeter. The mission was labeled Code Red Priority. The convoy consisted of 2 heavy cargo trucks, an armored jeep, and Evie's communication half-track, which was providing the forward coordination and radio link. They moved in the dead of night, using blackout lamps, navigating the twisted, rubble-strewn roads that were little more than trails carved through bomb craters. The air was frigid, thick with the smell of wet earth and high explosives. This time there was no surprise. Evie, monitoring the tactical frequency, heard the garbled reports. The Germans had anticipated a major resupply movement and had set up a deadly, classic L-shaped ambush along a narrow gorge. A kill zone where the trucks would be trapped against a sheer rock face. The ambush detonated with terrifying efficiency. The lead cargo truck, carrying the engine blocks, hit a mine, its cab instantly enveloped in a violent fireball. The armored jeep behind it swerved, blocking the road entirely. Evie's half-track was third in line. The moment the mine exploded, the ridge above them erupted with a hail of automatic gunfire and mortar rounds. They were pinned. Evie could hear the shrieks of the wounded and the desperate. Disorganized return fire from the 2 surviving drivers and Stefane, who immediately dismounted and began covering their flanks. Evie grabbed her microphone, trying to broadcast their situation, but the sheer volume of gunfire and static made the signal unusable. She had to transmit from a better position, and she had to do something about the wounded driver of the armored jeep, who was screaming for a medic, trapped inside his burning vehicle. Stefan, pinned down a few yards away, screamed her name, urging her to stay put. "Wait for the infantry, Sparky. Do not move!" But Evie saw the fire spreading on the jeep, saw the desperate, trapped soldier. She also saw the precious cargo, the penicillin, in the second cargo truck, miraculously untouched but sitting dead center in the killing field. She made a decision in the fraction of a second allowed by chaos. She grabbed her medical bag and her spare radio battery pack, wrenched open the hatch and plunged into the ambush zone. She moved low, using the smoking wreckage for cover, the sound of bullets whining past her head an unbearable symphony of death. She reached the jeep first, pulling the semi-conscious driver free just as the vehicle's fuel tank vented with a violent whoosh. Then she crawled toward the second cargo truck. She knew if the Germans managed to neutralize the remaining vehicles, they would simply blow them up to deny the Allies the critical supplies. She couldn't save the engine blocks, but the penicillin, the life-saving antibiotics, had to be secured. She fought her way into the truck's cab, found the ignition, and miraculously the engine turned over. It was a suicidal maneuver. She was exposing herself, an unarmored, obvious target, to the entire German ambush position. She shifted the massive vehicle into gear, the tires spinning on the slick stone, and drove it hard and fast backward, out of the kill zone and down a precarious embankment, the truck swaying wildly. The maneuver caught the Germans completely by surprise. As the truck careened down the slope, a final burst of heavy machine gun fire stitched a line across the truck's exposed side. Evie felt a tremendous, shattering blow to her left shoulder, followed by an immediate, agonizing numbness. The impact threw her against the steering wheel, and the truck finally ground to a halt 50 yards down the hill, out of the direct line of fire. The precious penicillin crates intact, but the driver barely conscious. When Stefan finally found her, having fought his way out of the ambush under heavy fire, he found Evie slumped over the wheel, blood pooling quickly on the floorboard of the cab. Her shoulder was shattered, a deep wound from a high-velocity round. But in her right hand, she still clutched the radio microphone. Her last conscious act was not to call for a medic, but to key the mic and whisper a single, agonizingly weak transmission to her headquarters. Penicillin secured. Route clear below. Ambush neutralized by withdrawal. The mission had been completed, the supplies saved, and the wounded driver was now safe. As she lost consciousness, her vision swimming in a sea of gray and red, the last thing she saw was the mud and grime covering her boots, now mixed with the deep, visceral red of her own sacrifice. The wound was real, the service undeniable, and the bureaucratic rules were now irrevocably moot. The journey from the shell-shocked cab of the supply truck to the relative sterility of the field hospital was a blur of searing pain and whispered morphine-fueled fantasies. Evie awoke weeks later in a general hospital further back from the line, somewhere near Naples. Her shoulder was immobilized in a cast, the wound deep and complex. A bullet had shattered bone and narrowly missed a major artery. The recovery was slow, tedious, and filled with the low, constant moans of the truly broken men around her. She was the only woman in the ward, a fact that both isolated her and gave her a strange, protected status. The nurses, her fellow WACs, treated her with a combination of reverence and concern. The doctors, grizzled, overworked men who had seen every conceivable way a body could be damaged, simply treated her as a casualty, the same as any other GI it was during this time of forced inactivity that she was confronted, not by enemy fire but by the weight of her own actions. The official report, meticulously detailed by Major Wallace and corroborated by a tearful, grateful driver whose life she had saved, left no room for the usual administrative deceit. Evie Reed had voluntarily entered a fire zone, performed an act of extreme valor under direct fire, saved critical medical supplies, and suffered a grievous wound in the process. The regulations might forbid women from engaging in combat, but they could not ignore a wound sustained by fire in the selfless performance of duty. The word was passed up the chain of command, past the desk of bureaucrats worried about precedent, until it reached the desk of General Mark Clark, the commander of the Fifth Army, the man who knew better than anyone the sheer cost of the Italian campaign. The medal presentation was not the grand parade Danny Miller imagined. It was a quiet, private affair in the hospital's administrative office, a small room dominated by a map of the current front. General Clark, a man notorious for his demanding nature and gruff exterior, stood before her. Evie, pale and still struggling with the sling on her arm, felt a terrifying numbness. She was being honored for an act that had nearly killed her, an act that had shattered her body, and she felt no triumph, only a deep, weary ache that had nothing to do with her shoulder. The general didn't read a florid citation. He simply looked at Evie, his eyes reflecting a profound understanding of the battlefield's horror. He pinned the Purple Heart onto the breast pocket of her freshly pressed olive-drab hospital bathrobe. The metal felt heavy, colder than she expected. "You are being decorated," the general said, his voice surprisingly soft, "for the wound you sustained while saving the lives of your fellow soldiers and maintaining the logistics of this campaign. Technician Reed, you were in the line of duty. That line, as you well know, is wherever the supplies are and wherever the fighting is. It is an honor to award you this." He then shook her hand, not with the hearty grip of a general, but with the gentle respect of a man acknowledging a shared trauma. He then looked down at the medal which shone dully in the office light. "This medal," he continued, "is not for the brave. It is for the wounded. It means you saw the very worst of it and survived. Wear it, not as a badge of honor, but as a reminder that the war leaves its scars on the inside, too. The real fight isn't over yet. That was the silent burden that returned with her to the States. The knowledge that the visible scar on her jaw and the deep, throbbing ache in her shoulder were nothing compared to the invisible wounds Clark had warned her about. She carried the face of the wounded Jeep driver, the sight of Stefane's panicked face, and the sound of the screaming Mimis in the dark. The Purple Heart was proof of her physical courage, the cold, hard object that silenced the scoffers like Danny Miller. But it was also a permanent physical link to the terror she desperately wanted to forget. She was medically discharged, returned home not as a hero in a victory parade, but as a quiet, competent woman with a wounded body and a soul profoundly altered by the raw brutality of necessity. She had the right to wear the boots, the right to the medal, and the right to the quiet dignity of a veteran who had fought and bled on a field the official reports preferred to deny. She kept the medal tucked away, bringing it out only when she needed the silent, undeniable weight of proof. The train station at Fort Bragg, the coal smoke, the shifting shadows, all of it came rushing back to Evie. The years melted away, and she was no longer the scarred veteran, but the terrified mechanic clinging to a wrench under a hail of shrapnel. She saw Danny Miller's face frozen in a mask of arrested judgment and knew her story had found its mark. She hadn't told him the full, graphic horror of the wounds she'd witnessed, nor the nightmares that still came after the all-clear. But she had given him the bare, undeniable trajectory, the expertise, the necessity, the selfless action, and the blood spilled. Danny Miller. The young soldier bound for the Pacific sat utterly still, his uniform now feeling not too large but too clean. His own hands, pale and soft, felt inadequate compared to the working hands of the woman before him. He saw the faint, silvery trace of the scar on her jaw, a line he had dismissed earlier as an old childhood injury, and now he understood it was a brand, a companion piece to the medal she had shown him. His preconceived notions of the front line and the true meaning of combat lay shattered on the dusty platform, utterly demolished by the forgotten reality of the logistics war. The true combat zone, he now understood, was anywhere a soldier was trying to complete a vital mission and an enemy was trying to stop them. A bullet did not care about the uniform's designation, only its trajectory. Evie finally broke the long, emotional silence. She took a slow, deep breath, adjusting the worn duffel bag at her feet. "So, Private," she said, her voice softer now, having deposited the heavy weight of the story. "That is how a logistics mechanic, a Signal Corps WAC, earns the right to wear those boots. They are not merely footwear for walking to the front. They are the tools for keeping the front alive." Danny swallowed hard, his throat dry. He struggled to find words, realizing a simple apology was grossly insufficient for his earlier arrogance. He looked down at the boots on her feet, the mud stains long dried, the leather creased and scuffed in a pattern that spoke of relentless use, of mountain roads and muddy tracks. They were not a fashion statement or a political symbol. They were a record of survival. "Ma'am," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper, I had no idea. I apologize, truly. I thought service had to look a certain way. I thought courage wore only one uniform." Evie offered a faint, tired smile. She picked up the velvet box, pausing before tucking it back into her coat pocket. She looked at the Purple Heart one last time, an object of profound and painful memory. "That is the hardest part of war, Private," she said. "Learning that the heroics often happen not where the photographers are, but where the work is. The unsung logistics officer, the maintenance chief, the radio operator who stays at their post, they are the ones who allow the man with the rifle to be brave. Don't ever let a uniform or the lack of a traditional designation convince you of a soldier's worth. Look at the scars, both inside and out. They always tell the truth. A sudden, sharp whistle cut through the train shed. Danny's transport train was pulling in. A monstrous black machine hissing steam and smoke, ready to carry him toward his own crucible in the Pacific. He stood, snapping to attention almost instinctively, his back straight, his eyes still fixed on her. He no longer saw a glorified clerk. He saw a veteran, a hero, a comrade in arms who had bled on a forgotten Italian mountain so that men like him could still have a supply line to follow. Evie nodded toward the train. Go on, Private. Get your fuel and your medical supplies to the men who need them. Your fight is waiting. And remember what I told you. Keep the radio working. Danny nodded sharply, a salute in his eyes, his respect now absolute. He turned and marched toward the train, his combat boots clunking with a newfound serious intent. He was no longer just a naive recruit. He was a link in a chain of sacrifice he now knew spanned far wider than his textbooks described. Evie watched him go, a single, silent sentinel on the platform, and only when he had disappeared into the crowded passenger car did she allow herself a moment of quiet exhaustion. She settled back onto the bench, her shoulder aching with the ghost of the bullet. She closed her eyes, the Purple Heart safely hidden, its heavy presence a constant, silent comfort. Her train, the one taking her to her new posting as an instructor back home, was due any minute. But as she waited, she realized that even after her story, after the powerful, irrefutable proof of her sacrifice, there was one question she hadn't answered. A quiet mystery she had consciously left dangling in the air. Danny Miller was gone, but the audience, the nation that would watch this documentary, still had to wonder. Her wound had been grievous, her valor undeniable, but how did the German ambush, the one she escaped, end? She had saved the penicillin and a fellow soldier. But what had happened to Stéphane, the French resistance fighter who had covered her frantic retreat and had disappeared back into the hail of machine gun fire to save her?